Congratulations, you are a sailor. Not the romantic kind. Not the sailor of the popular imagination, standing at the prow of a tall ship with wind in his hair and adventure in his eyes, and a general sense that the horizon is a promise rather than a threat. Not that sailor, the other kind. The kind who signed the articles in a Lisbon or Seville or Bristol dockside tavern in the late 15th or 16th century, who handed over their signature or their mark to a document they may not have been able to read, who accepted the advance pay that seemed generous on the dock and would seem considerably less generous by the third month at sea, and who is now standing on the deck of a vessel that is smaller than you expected, smells worse than you could have anticipated, and is heading in a direction that the captain has described as the route to the Indies, with a confidence that the available geographical knowledge does not entirely support. The age of exploration, the great century of European maritime expansion, roughly from the Portuguese voyages along the African coast in the early 15th century through the circumnavigation of Magellan and Elcano in 1519 to 1522, through the establishment of the regular Atlantic and Pacific routes that connected Europe to the Americas, Africa, and Asia in an unprecedented global network of trade and exchange. The period that produced Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus and Ferdinand Magellan and Francis Drake, and the dozens of less famous captains and navigators whose voyages opened the world's oceans to European ships. This is the period you've signed up for. And the history books, the ones that existed in your time, the chronicles and the cosmographies and the accounts of the great discoveries, describe it in terms of heroism and glory and the expansion of the known world. The captains get the glory. The cartographers get to put their names on the maps. You are not the captain. You are not the cartographer. You are one of the 20 or 40 or 80 men who will spend the next several months or years, if the voyage goes badly, living in conditions that the historical record, when it bothers to describe them from the sailor's perspective rather than the officer's, reveals to be among the most physically punishing available to a human being in the 16th century. And the 16th century had considerable competition in the category of physically punishing. Let's be clear about what you've actually signed up for. The voyage you're about to undertake is a genuine feat of human endurance, not in the inspiring, overcoming adversity sense that the commemorative plaques suggest, but in the raw, biological, day-by-day sense of a body trying to stay alive in conditions that are actively hostile to human life. The ship is a disease vector. The food is going to become a serious problem. The water is going to become a critical problem. The weather is going to become a mortal problem. The relationship between you and the ship's hierarchy, the captain and the officers and the master and the pilot, and all the layers of authority between the top of the ship's social structure and the bottom, where you are, is going to become a psychological problem that the physical problems will amplify. And you signed up willingly, more or less. The reasons people signed up for the voyages of the age of exploration are various and illuminating. The advance pay, which was real, and which solved immediate financial problems. The promise of a share of whatever trade goods or prizes the voyage produced, which was real in theory and variable in practice. The legal pressure, desertion, debt, or minor criminal charges that made staying ashore problematic for some men. The genuine desire for adventure, which was real and which should not be dismissed, because the romance of the sea was real, even if the reality of the sea was not romantic. The lack of better options, which was the most common reason and the one least likely to appear in the chronicles. You are on the dock. The ship is in front of you. The tide turns in an hour. Let's talk about the ship first, because the ship is where you're going to live, and the ship is the first problem. Chapter 1. The ship. Your home for the next several months and everything wrong with it. The ship is smaller than you thought. This is the universal first reaction of everyone who has ever stood on a dock and actually looked at the vessel they were about to cross an ocean in. The ships of the age of exploration were not small by the standards of their time. A Portuguese carrack or a Spanish now of the late 15th century, was a significant maritime engineering achievement, representing the accumulated knowledge of generations of Iberian and Mediterranean shipbuilders, and capable of sustained deep ocean sailing in ways that earlier European vessels were not. But they were small in absolute terms. The Santa Maria, Columbus's flagship, the largest of his 3 ships on the 1492 voyage, was approximately 18 meters long and 6 meters wide, with a displacement of perhaps 100 tons. The vessel that carried you, your crewmates, the provisions for an unknown duration of voyage, the trading goods, the weapons, the spare equipment, and the various personnel, the officers, the pilot, the surgeon if you were lucky enough to have one, the priest, across the open ocean was, in modern terms, roughly the size of a large fishing boat. You're going to live on this boat, not visit it, live on it for months, in the specific intimacy that a vessel this size imposes on everyone aboard. The crew's living space was, in the plainest terms, the deck. The officers had the cabins, the small enclosed spaces in the stern castle that provided some protection from the elements and some privacy. The captain had the best cabin, which was by modern standards a cramped wooden box with a hanging berth and a chart table. The ordinary sailors had the deck and the forecastle, the raised forward section of the ship that provided slightly more shelter than the open main deck, and the space between decks, the tween decks area, that was low-ceilinged, dark, and perpetually damp. There were no bunks for the crew in the modern sense. There were no dedicated sleeping spaces at all in most vessels of the early exploration period. You slept where you could, on the deck if the weather permitted, in the tween decks if it didn't, wrapped in whatever you had, in whatever space wasn't occupied by cargo or equipment or another crew member who had gotten there first. The hammock, the sleeping device that would eventually become the standard sailor's bed, and that represented a genuine ergonomic advance over the deck, was encountered by European sailors in the Caribbean in the 1490s, adopted by some navies in the 16th century, and gradually became standard, but was not universally available in the earliest voyages. The sailor of Columbus's 1492 crossing slept on deck or on the hard wood of the tween decks, in a way that his hammock-equipped successor a century later had improved upon. The smell of the ship. Every account of Age of Exploration voyages that addresses the sensory reality of the vessel comments on the smell, and the comments share a specific quality. The writers are reaching for language adequate to describe something that exceeded the normal vocabulary of unpleasantness. The ship smelled of bilge water, the water that accumulated in the lowest part of the hull, below the deck planking in the bilge, where it mixed with everything that seeped down through the ship. Seawater, spilled food, the biological waste of the crew and the animals, the decomposing organic matter that the bilge collected over time. The bilge was pumped regularly. The bilge pump was a standard piece of ship's equipment, and the pumping of the bilge was a regular crew duty, but pumping the bilge reduced the water level. It didn't clean or deodorize the bilge itself. The smell of bilge water was the ship's fundamental, irreducible odor, present at all times, rising through the deck, planking into the living spaces, absorbed into the clothing and the hair and the skin of everyone aboard, on top of the bilge smell. The smell of the cargo, depending on what the ship was carrying, trade goods, provisions, livestock. The cargo contributed its own aromatic dimension to the ship's environment. Live animals on deck or in the hold, the chickens, the pigs, the goats that were carried on most long voyages as a supply of fresh meat and eggs. Animals produce waste, with the continuous industrious commitment of organisms that have no alternative, and the waste of the ship's animals was managed with whatever combination of cleaning and tolerance the situation allowed, on top of the cargo smell. The crew, a crew of 40 men, at sea for weeks or months, without the bathing facilities that would have been inadequate even on land, in the specific conditions of physical labor and salt spray that made cleanliness a theoretical concept rather than a practical achievement. The smell of 40 men who had been at sea for 6 weeks was specific. The contemporary accounts that mention it do so with the resigned directness of people describing a thing that could not be helped and that had therefore ceased to require either apology or elaboration. The dampness was the other constant. A wooden ship was a wet ship, not sinking wet, but perpetually inescapably damp. The ocean spray came over the bow and the sides in any kind of weather. The rain came down when it rained. The dew condensed on every surface in the morning. The bilge water was present below. The caulking between the hull planks, the tarred hemp that sealed the joints, was imperfect in ways that allowed a continuous seepage of water into the ship's interior. Everything on the ship was damp. The clothing, the bedding, the food supplies, the rope, the wood of the structure itself. Damp wool doesn't dry quickly. Damp leather doesn't dry quickly. The sailor's clothing, saturated with salt spray and sweat, and the general moisture of the ship's environment, was damp most of the time, and the specific discomfort of spending weeks in damp clothing was one of the most persistently miserable features of maritime life in the period. The ship's equipment, the rigging, the sails, the anchors, the tackle, was the sailor's primary working environment and required constant maintenance. The ropes of the rigging, hemp rope, which stretched and rotted and frayed with a commitment that kept the crew continuously busy with splicing and replacement. The sails, canvas sails that chafed and tore and had to be repaired in all conditions, including the conditions under which they were most likely to tear, which is to say the bad ones. The wooden structure of the ship itself, which expanded and contracted with changes in temperature and humidity, which could be holed by striking an object, which could be damaged by the teredo worm, the shipworm that bored into unprotected wooden hulls with the specific patient destructiveness of an organism that has evolved specifically for this purpose. The teredo worm deserves a moment, because it was one of the more insidious enemies of the Age of Exploration's ships. The teredo, technically not a worm, but a species of bivalve mollusk, Teredo navalis, bored into the submerged wood of ship hulls, excavating tunnels that could reduce a ship's structural integrity from the outside without the damage being visible until the hull was inspected out of water. Ships that had been in tropical waters, where the teredo was most active, could have their hulls riddled with the worm's tunnels within months of deployment. The solution was careening, heeling the ship over on a beach or in a sheltered harbor to expose the hull, scraping it clean and applying protective coatings, pine tar, tallow, a mixture of pitch and lime that deterred the worm. Careening was time-consuming, labor-intensive, and only possible when a suitable location was available. Ships that couldn't be careened regularly in tropical waters could be destroyed by teredo damage in a matter of months. Magellan's fleet, during its circumnavigation, found some of its ships so badly damaged by shipworm in the Pacific that structural integrity was a genuine concern. Your ship is, right now, at the beginning of the voyage, in the best condition it will be in for the entire voyage. Everything will get worse from here. The rigging will fray, the hull will accumulate worm damage and fouling, the provisions will diminish, the crew will weaken. The ship that returns from a long voyage, if it returns, is a vessel that has been pushed to the limits of its structural and material integrity, and that requires comprehensive refitting before it can sail again. You are standing on this vessel. The anchor is being weighed, the sails are being set, the dock is getting smaller behind you. The voyage has begun, and the first problem, which is also the most constant problem, and the problem that will shape everything else about your experience, is the food. Chapter 2. The food. What you eat, how long it lasts, and why the last month is the worst you are going to eat badly. This is not a minor observation. The nutrition available to a sailor on a long ocean voyage in the Age of Exploration was one of the most significant limiting factors on what those voyages could achieve, and the specific ways in which it was bad were not merely uncomfortable, but physiologically consequential in ways that killed people. Not quickly, in most cases. Slowly, systematically, in the specific way of deficiency, diseases, that the 16th century could observe but couldn't explain because the concept of vitamins was 400 years in the future. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's start with what you eat before it goes wrong. The provisions loaded onto a ship before a long voyage were the product of considerable logistical planning and represented the best available understanding of what would keep men alive at sea for extended periods. The basic principle was enough calories to fuel the physical labor of sailing in a form that would not spoil before it was consumed. The second part of this requirement was the genuinely difficult one, because the preservation technologies available in the 15th and 16th centuries, salt, smoke, drying, pickling, were effective for weeks and adequate for months, but not reliably sufficient for the year-plus durations that the longest voyages required. The hardtack. Let's start with the hardtack, because the hardtack was the foundation of the sailor's diet, and the food item whose miseries were most consistently documented across the accounts of the period. Hardtack was a biscuit, the word biscuit coming from the French biscuit, twice cooked, made from flour and water, baked until it was so dry that moisture couldn't penetrate it. The twice-baked hardtack, sometimes called ship's biscuit or sea biscuit, was not designed to be edible in the pleasant sense of the word. It was designed to be stable, to resist the mold and weevil infestation that destroyed ordinary bread within days at sea. The hardtack of the age of exploration was a dense, rock-hard disc that could last for months if kept dry, and that provided calories in the form of carbohydrates without providing much else. The eating of hardtack required technique. You could not simply bite into it. The density of a properly made hardtack was sufficient to damage teeth that were not applied to it carefully, and the sailors who had been at sea long enough had developed the habit of soaking the biscuit in whatever liquid was available, water, wine, broth, before attempting to consume it. The soaking softened the biscuit to a texture that was edible without being appetizing. The soaking also revealed the other inhabitants of the hardtack, weevils, the small beetles whose larvae tunneled through the biscuit, leaving their presence as small wriggling discoveries in the soaking liquid, were a near universal feature of ship's biscuit on any long voyage. The experienced sailor's response to weevils in the biscuit was not revulsion but pragmatism. Tap the biscuit on a hard surface to dislodge the majority of the larvae before eating. Eat in the dark if available, so you couldn't see what remained, and consider the weevils a source of protein. The accounts of sailors who drew the line at weevil-contaminated biscuit are considerably rarer than the accounts of sailors who ate it anyway, because the alternative to weevil-contaminated biscuit was hunger. Mold was the other biscuit problem. Despite the best efforts of the twice baking and the drying, biscuit stored in the conditions of a ship's hold, the dampness, the temperature variations, the unavoidable moisture, would eventually mold. Mold could be scraped off, and was. The biscuit beneath the scraped mold was then eaten. This was the calculus of the long voyage sailor. The standard of food quality had to be adjusted to the available options, and the available options, by the third month of a long voyage, were typically worse than anything you would have accepted on land. The salt meat. Alongside the hardtack, the primary protein source of the age of exploration sailor was salt-preserved meat, beef or pork, packed in barrels with salt brine, which inhibited the bacterial spoilage that would have destroyed fresh meat within days. Salt meat was the sailor's main protein source, and at the beginning of the voyage, it was recognizably meat in texture and flavor, allowing for the fact that it had been brined to a salinity that made it need soaking before cooking to reduce the salt to edible levels. As the voyage extended, the quality of the salt meat declined. The brine in the barrels became less effective. The meat at the bottom of the barrel, under the weight of the layers above it, compressed and changed texture. Meat that had been adequate at the beginning of the voyage became problematic by the middle, and in the worst cases, actively inedible by the end. The smell of a salt meat barrel that had failed was not a subtle indicator of the problem, and the crew's response to it was the specific despair of people who have been looking forward to their next meal and discovered that the next meal is not available. the dried fish, bacalhau, the salt cod that the Portuguese in particular relied on, and dried fish preparations from various other traditions, was the other major preserved protein source. Dried fish lasted longer than salt meat in many conditions and provided protein and some fats. Its flavor after extended storage was, by most accounts, aggressively assertive rather than pleasant, but its calories were real, and its relative stability compared to salt meat made it valuable on the longest voyages. The legumes, dried peas, beans, lentils, were carried in quantity and provided the bulk of the caloric and protein content of the daily meal in the form of the pottage or stew that was the ship's cook's primary product. The cook, the ship's cook, typically one of the least skilled members of the crew assigned to the role, because cooking at sea was less about culinary skill than about managing a fire in a sandpit on a wooden ship in all weather conditions, produced a daily stew from whatever was available. The dried legumes, some salt meat or fish, water, and whatever spices or flavorings remained in the ship's supplies. The cooking fire of the Age of Exploration ship was a fire in a sandpit or firebox, typically in the forecastle, designed to prevent sparks from reaching the wooden structures around it. In rough weather, the fire was extinguished as a safety measure, and in rough weather the crew ate cold food or no food, the hardtack, the raw salt meat, the dried fish, without the hot meal that was the day's primary comfort and caloric source. In storms of extended duration, the crew might go days without a hot meal, consuming cold provisions in conditions that the hot meal was specifically needed to address. Wine and water. The beverage situation of the Age of Exploration ship was organized around two liquids: wine, which was carried in quantity because it preserved better than water and provided calories as well as the morale benefits of alcohol, and water, which was the more critical and the more problematic. Water was carried in wooden casks and barrels, and water stored in wood in the conditions of a ship's hold was water that underwent a specific transformation over time. The first days, the water was fine or relatively fine, with the slight woody taste of the cask, but without the biological activity that would develop. As weeks passed, the water in the cask began to support the microbiological life that the cask's wood harbored, and that the water's neutral chemistry allowed to flourish. The water went green, then produced a visible growth, then developed a smell. The sailor who encountered the green-smelling water of a cask that had been at sea for 2 months had the choice between drinking it, holding their breath, consuming it quickly, and accepting the gastrointestinal consequences that the contaminated water sometimes produced, or going without water, which was not a long-term option. Most sailors drank the water. The gastrointestinal consequences were a standard feature of maritime life, contributing to the general physical misery of the long voyage. The wine preserved better than the water and was more reliably safe to drink, and the ratio of wine to water in. The sailor's daily ration, typically a pint of wine or more with water as the supplement, reflected this practical reality. The alcohol in the wine inhibited bacterial growth in ways that made wine a more stable beverage than water in the conditions of the ship's hold. The fresh provisions, the fruit and vegetables that were loaded at the beginning of the voyage and at every port where they were available were the nutritional bright spot of the early voyage weeks. Fresh food, eaten while it lasted, provided the vitamins and minerals that the preserved provisions couldn't supply. The problem was that fresh food didn't last. The fruit was gone in weeks. The vegetables lasted longer if kept dry and cool, but were exhausted within the first month of a long ocean crossing. After that, the preserved provisions indefinitely. The specific nutritional deficiency that resulted from the long absence of fresh food was scurvy. And scurvy is the story within the food story, the consequence that turned dietary inadequacy into a killing disease that shaped the Age of Exploration as profoundly as any storm or navigation error. Chapter 3. The scurvy, the disease that defined long distance sailing and killed more sailors than storms. You are approximately 6 weeks into the voyage. The The fresh fruit and vegetables loaded at the last port are gone. The diet is now entirely preserved food. The hardtack, the salt meat, the dried fish, the legume stew, the wine, and the increasingly questionable water. The diet is caloric. You are not starving in the sense of insufficient calories, but it is nutritionally incomplete in a way that your body is now beginning to register. The first sign is subtle. The gums are slightly tender. You notice it when you chew the hardtack that has been soaked but not quite softened enough. The specific soreness that you attribute to the hardness of the biscuit. The fatigue is present too, but fatigue is present normally at C, the physical labor, the watch system, the inadequate sleep, and attributing the tiredness to the diet rather than the work is not the obvious conclusion. 6 weeks becomes 8 weeks. The gum tenderness has become gum swelling. The gums are puffy and red and bleed when you press them. Old wounds that healed months ago have begun to reopen. The cut on your forearm from the rigging work 3 weeks ago had healed, you thought, but the scar has broken down, and the wound is open again, as if it never healed. The joint pain has arrived. The knees, the hips, the specific deep ache of joints that feel wrong in a way that doesn't correspond to any injury you can identify. What is happening to you is this. You have a profound deficiency of vitamin C, a compound that your body cannot synthesize and must obtain from food, and whose absence prevents the production of collagen, the structural protein that maintains the integrity of connective tissues, blood vessels, wound healing, and bone. Without adequate vitamin C, the collagen in your body is degrading. The connective tissues are losing their structural integrity. The blood vessels are becoming fragile. The healed wounds are losing the collagen that maintain their closure. Your body is, in the most literal sense, coming apart. Scurvy, the disease produced by vitamin C deficiency, was the defining occupational disease of the age of exploration sailor, and its scale is genuinely difficult to grasp. The historian Kenneth Kippel estimated that scurvy killed more sailors between 1500 and 1800 than all other causes of maritime death combined. More than storms, more than combat, more than shipwreck. Vasco da Gama's 1497 to 1499 voyage to India lost approximately 100 of his 170 men, the majority to scurvy. Magellan's circumnavigation lost approximately 80% of its crew, roughly 230 of 270 men, with scurvy contributing substantially to that mortality. The specific horror of scurvy was its progression. In the early stages, it was unpleasant, the gum disease, the fatigue, the reopened wounds. In the middle stages, it was debilitating. The severe joint pain, the inability to work, the swelling and hemorrhaging under the skin that produced the characteristic dark blotches of advanced scurvy. In the final stages, it was a specific and terrible death. The spontaneous hemorrhage, the collapse of the body's connective tissues, the old fractures that had healed years before, spontaneously refracturing as the bone's collagen matrix degraded. Scurvy killed experienced, fit sailors who had been perfectly healthy at the voyage's beginning. It killed officers as well as crew. It killed men in ways that the 16th century's medical framework, organized around the humoral theory that identified disease as humoral imbalance, could observe but not explain, because the concept of a specific dietary component whose absence caused a specific disease was not available. The treatments that were attempted were mostly useless because they were derived from the wrong theoretical framework. Purging, bleeding, the various preparations of the ship's medicine chest. None of these addressed the underlying deficiency because none of the practitioners knew that there was a deficiency. The humoral interpretation of scurvy saw it as a disease of excess black bile, the cold, dry humor, and treated it accordingly with warming, drying preparations that had no relationship to the actual problem. What worked, what actually treated or prevented scurvy, was citrus fruit or other sources of vitamin C, fresh fruit and vegetables, spruce beer, used by some northern European navigators, the juice of lemons or limes or oranges, and the evidence that these things worked was available throughout the age of exploration. There are documented cases from the early 16th century of sailors whose scurvy resolved dramatically after eating fresh fruit, and the correlation between fresh fruit and recovery was observed repeatedly. The problem was not the evidence. The problem was the theory. The medical framework of the period had no mechanism for understanding why a food would prevent or cure a disease, because the concept of a disease caused by the absence of something rather than the presence of something was outside the framework's explanatory range. The humoral theory was a theory of excesses, too much blood, too much bile, and deficiency was not a category it had. So the observation that citrus fruit cured scurvy was made repeatedly and acted on only partially and inconsistently, because it couldn't be fitted into a coherent theoretical explanation that would have made it a standard medical recommendation. The specific discovery that scurvy was a deficiency disease, the identification of vitamin C as the missing compound, and the systematic implementation of citrus fruit rations in naval operations to prevent it didn't happen until the 18th century. James Linn's controlled trial in 1747, the Royal Navy's adoption of lemon juice rations in 1795, the full theoretical explanation of vitamin C only coming in the early 20th century. In the meantime, in your time, the 15th and 16th centuries, scurvy killed sailors on a scale that the age of exploration's heroic narrative consistently underreports. The voyages of discovery were, in their biological reality, voyages of scurvy. The ships that arrived at their destinations were ships whose crews had survived the disease or been spared by the chance availability of fresh food at ports along the way. The ships that didn't arrive, that disappeared without trace in the open ocean, were sometimes ships whose crews had been so reduced by scurvy that they could no longer sail the vessel. You have scurvy. At the moderate stage, the gum disease, the reopened wound, the joint pain. Around you, some crewmates are worse. The man in the corner of the 'tween decks who hasn't come on watch for 3 days is in the advanced stage. The hemorrhagic stage, the dark patches under his skin, the inability to move without severe pain. The ship's surgeon, if this voyage is fortunate enough to have a surgeon, is examining him with the limited tools of 16th century medicine and the specific helpless frustration of a practitioner who recognizes the disease and has nothing adequate to offer. The navigator thinks there is land within a week, maybe 2 weeks. Land means fresh food. Fresh food means the possibility of recovery. If the man in the corner of the 'tween decks lives another 2 weeks, he has a chance. If he doesn't, we will address the mortality. But first, let's talk about the water situation more specifically, because the water is a crisis that arrives before the scurvy does. Chapter 4, the water, the most critical resource, and how it perpetually failed. Water was the limiting factor. Not the wind, not the navigation, not the enemy ships, not the storms, though all of these were significant. Water was the variable that determined, more than any other single factor, how far a ship could go and how long it could stay. A ship could survive weeks of calm with patience. It could survive storms with seamanship and luck. It could survive scurvy, partially, if it reached land in time. It could not survive without water for more than 3 days, because the human body's need for water was not negotiable in the way that its need for calories could be partially deferred. The water casks, loaded at the start of the voyage, were the voyage's most critical cargo, and their management, the rationing that extended them as far as possible, the monitoring that identified failing casks before the water became completely undrinkable, the desperate search for fresh water at every landfall, was one of the captain's primary concerns and one of the crew's primary anxieties. The daily water ration on a long voyage was, by modern standards, inadequate. The standard ration varied by ship, by captain, and by the assessment of how long the crossing would take. But typical estimates for Spanish and Portuguese vessels of the period run to approximately 1 liter of water per man per day, supplemented by wine, which added another pint or so of liquid. 1 liter of water per day was sufficient to avoid acute dehydration in mild weather conditions, doing moderate physical labor. It was insufficient in hot weather. in the doldrums near the equator, where the sun was direct and the air still, and the physical labor of trying to move the ship in no wind was exhausting. And it was insufficient for men doing the heavy work of storm sailing. The rationing created a specific social dynamic on the ship. The water was controlled, locked in many cases, with the key held by the captain or the master, and the daily ration distribution was a moment of careful measurement and careful watching. A crew that suspected the officers were receiving a larger ration than the common sailors was a crew whose simmering resentments found a specific daily focus. Water theft was a crime treated with harsh punishment on most ships. The thief who broke into the water stores was stealing not just his own extra ration, but potentially the lives of his crewmates, and the punishments recorded in the accounts of the period reflected this understanding. Flogging, reduction of rations, confinement, the hierarchy of ship punishment was applied with particular seriousness to water theft. The process of water becoming undrinkable in the wooden casks was not uniform. Different casks failed at different rates, depending on the quality of the wood, the completeness of the initial cleaning, the position in the hold. The cask keeper, in larger ships, a designated role, was responsible for monitoring the casks and identifying those that were failing. The failing cask was a management problem. The water could be used quickly before it became completely unusable, mixed with wine to mask the deterioration, or in extremis discarded. The sailor's relationship with the increasingly bad water developed over the voyage into the specific tolerance of necessity. The green water, the water that had developed algal growth, was filtered through cloth before drinking, the cloth removing the most visible biological material. The smelling water was held at arm's length, drunk quickly, and followed with whatever could mask the aftertaste. The water that was genuinely undrinkable, that had reached the stage of active putrefaction, was discarded, and the crew's ration was reduced to account for the lost cask. Reduced water rations at sea produced a specific physiological and psychological response. The thirst that results from inadequate hydration became a persistent background state, never quite satisfied by the ration, the body continuously registering its need for more water than it was receiving. The men on reduced rations became irritable in the specific way of the chronically thirsty, short-tempered, obsessive about the ration distribution, unable to think about much else when the thirst was acute. At sea, rain was a gift. When it rained, every available container, the casks, the cooking pots, the stretched sails, was positioned to collect the rainwater. The collection of rainwater was a practiced, organized, urgent activity. The crew spread sails or canvas to maximize the collection area, directed the runoff into the containers, and the fresh rainwater that fell into the casks was the specific, uncomplicated relief of water that was clean and cold and free of the biological history of the storage cask. The specific water crisis that was most feared was the becalmed ship in hot latitudes with failing casks and insufficient rain. The doldrums, the equatorial belt of light, variable winds that could becalm a sailing ship for days or weeks, were known to every sailor who had sailed the Atlantic or Pacific, and the experience of being becalmed in the doldrums, with the water running out, was one of the most desperate situations the age of exploration sailor faced. The sea around you in this situation was water, infinite water in every direction, water to the horizon and beyond, and none of it drinkable. The salt water of the ocean, if consumed, accelerated dehydration rather than relieving it, the kidneys unable to process the salt load without producing more urine than the fluid consumed. The sailors who drank seawater in desperation, and they did, the accounts documented, died faster than those who didn't. The psychological effect of being surrounded by water you couldn't drink, when your thirst was acute and your water ration had been cut to half a liter a day, was a specific torment that the literary imagination of the period captured in what became one of the most famous lines in English poetry. Samuel Taylor, Coleridge's "Water, water, everywhere, nor any drop to drink," written in 1798, drawing on the maritime literature of the exploration period, condensing the essential cruelty of the sailor's water situation into two lines that have never been improved upon. Land and its fresh water, the rivers and springs of the coast was the relief from the water crisis that every ship sought, and the navigation of the age of exploration was partly organized around the management of this need. The routes established by the Portuguese down the African coast and across to Brazil were routes that accounted for the location of watering points. The decision to stop at a given island or coastal location was often a water decision as much as a navigation decision. The watering stop was its own set of problems. Fresh water sources on unfamiliar coasts might be contaminated, might be guarded by populations who didn't welcome European ships, might require extensive searching to find. The work of filling the water casks, rolling them ashore, filling them from the source, rolling them back, loading them back on the ship, was heavy, exhausting labor in whatever conditions the stop provided, and the time spent watering was time during which the ship was at anchor in a potentially hazardous location, subject to weather, to attack, and to the specific vulnerability of a vessel with its crew partially ashore. But the fresh water once obtained was worth all of it. The clean spring water filling a cask that had held the green, smelling water of the previous supply was one of the most intensely pleasurable sensory experiences available to the age of exploration sailor. You remember what water is supposed to taste like only after weeks of drinking water that is not supposed to taste the way it does, and the memory when the fresh water arrives is something closer to gratitude than simple satisfaction. Chapter 5. The hierarchy. Who was in charge, what they could do to you, and why you couldn't leave you are at the bottom of a hierarchy. This is a social fact with very direct physical consequences, because the hierarchy of a ship at sea in the age of exploration had enforcement mechanisms that the hierarchy of equivalent institutions on land did not possess. On land, if your employer mistreated you beyond endurance, you could leave, with consequences, with difficulty, but with the physical option of walking away. On a ship at sea, 3 months from the nearest port, you cannot leave. You are a crew member of a vessel that is approximately 500 miles from land in any direction, and the hierarchy has you in a space from which there is no exit except the sea. The captain was, in maritime law and in practice, an authority without parallel in most of the sailors' experience. The captain had the power to punish, to confine, to reduce rations, to order physical punishment. The captain's authority over the crew was close to absolute in the specific conditions of the ocean crossing, and this authority was exercised in ways that ranged from the professionally stern to the genuinely brutal, depending on the individual captain and the specific circumstances of the voyage. The legal framework governing ships of the age of exploration varied by nation. The Portuguese, Spanish, English, Dutch, and French maritime codes had their specific provisions, but they shared the common feature of granting the captain extensive disciplinary authority. The captain could order flogging for a range of offenses: insubordination, neglect of duty, theft, violence between crew members, the various small violations of ship's discipline that accumulated over the course of a long voyage. The flogging was conducted with a rope's end or a cat o' nine tails, and was applied publicly on deck before the assembled crew, the publicity being part of the punishment's deterrent function. The more serious punishments, keel hauling, running the gauntlet, death, were less routinely applied, but were legal and documented. Keel hauling, the punishment of being dragged under the keel of the ship through the water, was potentially fatal. The hull fouling that accumulated on the ship's bottom could lacerate the person being dragged across it, and the time spent underwater was sufficient to cause drowning in worse executions. It was a punishment whose severity communicated that the captain's authority extended to the boundary of execution. The specific dynamics of authority on a long voyage were complicated by the inevitable deterioration of conditions. As the voyage extended, the food got worse, the water got worse, the physical condition of the crew declined, the accumulated fatigue and the specific deprivations of the long crossing wore away at the men's capacity for the stoic acceptance of their situation that the hierarchy required. Mutiny was the ultimate expression of this deterioration, and the history of the age of exploration is threaded with mutinies near mutinies, and the specific management strategies that captains used to maintain control when the crew's endurance was approaching its limits. Columbus's 1492 voyage came close to open mutiny. The crew's anxiety about the length of the crossing, the unknown nature of the destination, the failure of land to appear on the schedule that Columbus had promised, produced the confrontation of October 10th that Columbus resolved by promising to turn back if land wasn't sighted in 3 days. Land was sighted on October 12th, which was fortunate for Columbus's historical reputation and probably for his immediate physical safety. Magellan faced more serious mutiny. The mutiny of Easter 1520 in the harbor of San Julian, in which 3 of his 5 captains revolted against the conditions of the voyage and his authority. Magellan suppressed it with the specific ruthlessness of a commander who understood that showing weakness in the face of open mutiny on a long voyage was not survivable. One of the rebel captains was killed in the fighting, one was executed, one was marooned. The surviving crew watched and understood what the suppression of mutiny looked like. The crew's management of the hierarchy, the ways they navigated the power structure while maintaining their own dignity and survival, was a matter of considerable practical intelligence. Direct confrontation with the captain's authority was, as Magellan's example demonstrated, extremely dangerous. The forms of resistance available to the ordinary sailor were more oblique. The slowdown in work that communicated dissatisfaction without the explicitness of insubordination. The complaint, framed carefully as a question about rations or conditions rather than a challenge to the captain's authority. The solidarity of the crew among themselves, the informal social structures that provided mutual support in the face of the official hierarchy. The watch system was the organizational structure of the ship's daily operation, and it was the framework within which the crew's daily life was organized. The crew was divided into watches, typically 2, the starboard watch and the larboard, port watch, who alternated periods of duty and rest. The standard watch was 4 hours on, 4 hours off, which meant that in a 24-hour day, you had 6 periods of 4 hours, 3 on duty and 3 theoretically resting. The theoretically resting qualification is important. The off-watch period was your time to sleep, eat, and maintain your personal equipment, but the off-watch period was also when all hands operations occurred, the emergency sail handling in a storm, the general work parties that required the full crew, the pumping of the bilge that was a constant requirement. A sailor who had just come off a 4-hour night watch and was trying to sleep was also a sailor who could be called back on deck 20 minutes later because the weather had changed. The result was a chronic sleep deficit that characterized the long voyage, 4 hours of sleep at a time, interrupted by all hands calls in the damp and the noise of the ship's working environment, was not adequate rest for men doing the physical labor of sailing. The accumulation of sleep debt over weeks and months contributed to the declining physical and psychological resilience of the crew, which in turn made them more susceptible to the other stresses of the voyage. The scurvy, the bad water, the psychological pressure of the unknown route, and the extended separation from everything familiar. The pilot, the navigator, occupied a specific position in the ship's hierarchy that was distinct from the captain's authority. The pilot was responsible for the ship's route, the navigation that determined where the ship was and where it was going. This responsibility was technical in a way that the captain's command, authority, was not, and the pilot's specific expertise gave him a degree of influence that was independent of his formal rank. The navigation of the age of exploration was performed with the instruments and methods available: the magnetic compass for direction, the astrolabe, or cross staff, for latitude determination through measurement of the sun's noon altitude, the sandglass for timekeeping, the lead line for depth measurement in coastal waters. Dead reckoning, the estimation of position based on known speed, heading, and elapsed time, was the primary method for position estimation in open ocean, where the celestial measurements gave latitude but not longitude. Longitude on the east-west position was the great unsolved navigation problem of the age of exploration. Without a reliable method for determining longitude at sea, navigation in the open ocean was fundamentally uncertain in the east-west direction. and the errors that accumulated in dead reckoning over weeks of ocean crossing could put a ship dozens or even hundreds of miles from its estimated position. The ships that ran aground on uncharted coasts, that missed intended landfalls by margins that put them in danger, were ships whose longitude errors had been concealed by the dead reckoning's false precision. The pilot who told the captain where the ship was based on dead reckoning was, in many cases, telling the captain where the ship probably was, within an error range that the captain may not have fully understood and that the pilot may not have fully disclosed, because disclosing the uncertainty was professionally uncomfortable and potentially authority undermining. You are 3 months into a voyage whose destination remains uncertain in ways that the captain's charts and the pilot's calculations have not resolved, eating food that is increasingly problematic, drinking water that is increasingly questionable, with joints that ache and gums that bleed, in a hierarchy that has the power to flog you if you complain about any of this. You have not turned back, partly because the captain won't let you, partly because there is nowhere to turn back to that is significantly closer than the destination, and partly because, and this is the thing that the purely misery-focused account of the age of exploration misses, you are here for reasons that are not all negative, and the sea, for all its comprehensive awfulness, has compensations that keep men sailing it. Let's talk about what kept men going. Chapter 6. The weather. Storms becalming, and what the ocean actually did to ships. The weather is changing. You know this before the officer on watch announces it, because the sea has been telling you for the last hour in the specific language of the ocean that experienced sailors learn to read before they learn to articulate. The long, slow swell that arrives from the southwest without a corresponding wind, the progressive darkening of the horizon in the same direction, the particular quality of the light that has shifted from the clear brilliance of the morning to something flatter and more ominous. The barometric pressure is falling. Not that you have a barometer which won't be invented for another century, but the ache in the joints of the men who have been at sea long enough has its own barometric sensitivity, and the ship's oldest hand has been watching the southwest horizon with an expression that communicates his assessment of the situation without words. The assessment is, this is going to be bad. The storm systems of the open ocean were one of the defining threats of age of exploration sailing, and understanding what a storm actually meant to a 15th or 16th century wooden sailing ship requires setting aside the mental image of the sturdy vessel riding dramatic waves and replacing it with the physical reality of what enormous amounts of water in motion due to a structure of wood and rope and canvas. The ship you are on was built to sail. It was not built to survive every storm the ocean could produce, because no wooden sailing ship of the period was built to survive every storm the ocean could produce. The design was a compromise between seaworthiness and capacity, between the hull form that handled heavy weather best and the hull form that carried the most cargo, because the cargo was the commercial purpose of the voyage, and the commercial purpose was what paid for the voyage to exist. The result was a vessel that could handle moderate heavy weather with skill and some luck, that could survive severe weather with more skill and considerably more luck, and that in the worst of what the open ocean offered, the fully developed storm of the North Atlantic in winter, or the equatorial squall that arrived in minutes with no warning, or the typhoon of the Western Pacific, whose wind speeds exceeded anything the ship's designers had experience of, was in genuine danger of being lost. The Atlantic hurricane was the specific meteorological terror of the Caribbean crossing, and the Spanish and Portuguese navigators of the early 16th century encountered it with no prior experience of its specific character and no name for what it was. The word hurricane entered European languages from the Taino word huracan. The Taino people of the Caribbean had been living alongside these storms for generations and had developed both the vocabulary and the knowledge of their seasonal patterns that the European newcomers lacked. The hurricane arrived with a specific sequence: the long swell from the southeast, the increasing wind, the deterioration of visibility as cloud cover thickened, the rapid intensification as the storm's core approached. The wind speeds at the heart of a major hurricane exceeded anything that a 16th century sailing ship's rigging was designed to withstand, and the waves generated by sustained hurricane-force winds, waves of 10, 15, 20 meters, were waves that could overwhelm a vessel whose entire freeboard was less than 3 meters. The response to a developing storm was the systematic reduction of sail, the taking in of canvas to reduce the area exposed to the wind, reducing the force the rigging had to absorb, reducing the ship's speed. In moderate heavy weather, reduced sail allowed the ship to make controlled progress through the conditions. In severe weather, the sails were reduced further to storm sails, the smallest heavy canvas sails carried specifically for these conditions. In the worst weather, all sail was taken in. The ship was stripped bare, lying to under bare poles, riding the waves with no sail set at all. The crew's survival depending on the hull's ability to float rather than the sail's ability to drive. The work of sail handling in heavy weather was among the most physically dangerous activities in the age of exploration sailors' repertoire. The sails had to be furled, gathered in and tied to the yards, while the ship was in motion in heavy weather, which meant the men furling them were working on the yards, the horizontal spars from which the sails hung, 40 or 50 or 60 feet above the deck, holding on with one hand and working with the other while the ship rolled and pitched beneath them with the specific vicious unpredictability of a vessel in confused seas. The yard, in heavy weather, was moving, not gently swaying, moving through arcs of 15 or 20 degrees with each roll of the ship, the ends of the yard describing wide sweeps through the air at a height where a man who lost his grip had a long fall to the deck or the sea. Men fell from the yards. The accounts of the period document falls from yards in storms, with the matter-of-fact frequency of events that were expected and that the hierarchy of the ship processed as an occupational reality rather than a preventable tragedy. A man who fell from the yard onto the deck had a chance, depending on where he fell and what he fell on. A man who fell from the yard into the sea had, in heavy weather with the ship making any speed, essentially no chance. The ship could not be reliably stopped or turned in heavy weather to effect a rescue. The maneuver required time and sea room that the storm conditions might not permit. And the man in the water, even if sighted, was in water that the ship's boat couldn't be safely launched into. You watched him. You called to him. And then the ship moved on, because the ship had to. The loss of a man overboard in heavy weather was processed by the crew with the specific compressed grief of people who had no time for grief. The work continued, the watch continued, the storm continued, and the man was gone. The prayer said over him was brief or non-existent, depending on conditions, and the gap he left in the crew's roster was noted for the watch assignments and the ration calculations, and nothing else, because the ship required the attention of the living more urgently than it required mourning for the dead. Below decks in heavy weather was a specific misery. The 'tween decks, where the off-watch crew was supposed to be resting, was in a storm a dark, wet, violent space in which nothing was stable. The ship's motion in heavy weather, the combination of pitch, roll, and yaw that a vessel in a seaway produced, was not the gentle swaying of mild conditions. It was an unpredictable multi-axis movement that made standing without support impossible, made eating and drinking a physical challenge, and made sleep something that happened in the gaps between the worst lurches, rather than as a continuous restorative process. Seasickness was, for many crew members, a feature of heavy weather that compounded all the other miseries. The specific nausea of seasickness, the motion-triggered malfunction of the vestibular system that produced nausea and vomiting, was not something that experience eliminated for everyone. Some sailors adapted to the ship's motion and were never or rarely seasick. Others retained a sensitivity to motion that heavy weather reliably triggered regardless of their experience level. The seasick sailor in a storm was a sailor trying to do the physical work of heavy weather sailing while experiencing continuous nausea and periodic vomiting, which was as comprehensively unpleasant as it sounds. The Cape of Good Hope, the southernmost point of Africa, the passage between the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, was the most notorious single location in the age of exploration for severe weather, and the Portuguese navigators who first rounded it gave it initially a name that reflected their experience, Cabo das Tormentas, the Cape of Storms. King João II of Portugal renamed it the Cape of Good Hope, a rebranding that was optimistic in the specific way of someone who needed to encourage future voyagers to attempt the same route. But the original name stuck in the sailors' oral tradition because the original name was accurate. The weather systems of the Southern Ocean, where the Cape of Good Hope sits, were unlike anything the Mediterranean or North Atlantic sailor had encountered. The roaring 40s, the wind belt between 40 and 50 degrees south latitude, where the prevailing westerlies blow without the interruption of any significant landmass and build to sustained strengths that exceeded the storms of the northern oceans, produced seas of a scale and consistency that the ships of the period were genuinely not designed for. Bartolomeo Diaz, who first rounded the Cape in 1488, encountered a storm of sufficient severity that it drove him south of the Cape without his initially realizing he had passed it. The storm had taken the ship so far south and so far offshore that when it finally eased and he turned back north and east, he found himself in the Indian Ocean, the Cape already behind him. He confirmed the passage by sailing back west until he sighted the Cape from the Indian Ocean side. The Pacific presented different weather challenges. The doldrums, the equatorial calm belt between the trade wind systems of the northern and southern hemispheres, were the opposite of the storm problem. Not too much wind, but too little. A ship becalmed in the doldrums sat motionless on a flat, oily sea while the sun beat down from overhead, and the provisions continued to diminish, and the water continued to degrade, and the crew watched the horizon for any movement of air that might give them a breeze. The doldrums could last days. They could last weeks. Magellan's crossing of the Pacific becalmed the fleet for extended periods in equatorial latitudes, and the provisions consumed during those calms were provisions that had already been stretched for the Pacific crossing. Provisions that were running out before the fleet reached the Philippines. The combination of becalming and the resulting reduction of provisions to near nothing was a significant contributor to the mortality of the Pacific crossing, where men were dying of starvation as well as scurvy. The waterspout, the oceanic equivalent of the tornado, a column of rotating air descending from a storm cloud to the sea surface, was a weather phenomenon that the ships of the period occasionally encountered, and that the sailors responded to with a combination of practical avoidance and the specific rituals that the period's belief system prescribed for supernatural threats. The recitation of the Gospel of St. John, while the captain drew a cross in the air with his sword, was documented as the standard response to a waterspout approach, not instead of sailing around it, but alongside the sailing, because in a world where the natural and the supernatural were not fully distinguished, addressing both the physical and the spiritual dimensions of a threat was simply thorough preparation. The lightning of tropical storms was a direct and documented threat to sailing ships. The tall wooden mast was an effective lightning conductor in a world without lightning rods, and strikes to ships' masts were recorded, sometimes setting fire to the rigging, sometimes killing crew members standing near the struck mast. The St. Elmo's fire, the coronal discharge that appeared on masthead and yardarm tips in certain atmospheric conditions, the flickering blue-white light that was not lightning and was not fire, but was the electrical discharge of the ship's tall conductors into the charged air, was interpreted as a sign, positive or negative depending on which tradition you followed, and was watched by the crew with the mixed superstition and wonder that characterized the age of exploration. Sailors' relationship with atmospheric phenomena they couldn't explain. The storm passes. The sky clears with the specific washed clarity of post-storm weather, and the sea flattens from the chaos of the storm waves to the long, regular swell of the aftermath. The damage assessment begins. The sails that tore and need repair, the rigging that parted and needs splicing, the equipment that was lost overboard in the violence of the worst hours, the men who were injured, the bruises and cuts of being thrown against equipment in the ship's violent motion, the pulled muscles of the emergency sail handling, the man whose hand was crushed by a block and tackle during the storm, and who is now in the care of whatever medical resource the ship possesses. The medical resource is the next problem. Chapter 7. The medicine, what passed, for healthcare, on a long voyage, and why it sometimes made things worse. The ship's surgeon is looking at your hand, which you injured 3 days ago in the rigging work, a rope burn that seemed minor initially, and that has since become infected in the specific way of wounds in an environment of saltwater dirt, and the complete absence of sterile conditions. The wound is red and swollen beyond the original injury. The flesh around it is warm to the touch, and the warmth has begun to extend up toward the wrist, which the surgeon is examining with the clinical attention of a man who knows what spreading infection looks like and is calibrating the severity. The ship's surgeon, or the ship's barber surgeon, the designation varying by nationality and period, was a standard crew member on better provisioned voyages of the age of exploration, and his presence was a genuine improvement over the alternative of no medical care at all. The distinction between genuine improvement and comprehensively effective is important here, because the medicine of the late 15th and early 16th century was medicine operating within the humoral framework we've discussed in other contexts, and the humoral framework's specific limitations were as present at sea as they were on land, with the additional constraint that the resources available to the ship's surgeon were a fraction of what even a modest land-based practitioner would have had. The ship's medicine chest, the standard provision of medical supplies for the voyage, contained the tools and preparations of contemporary medicine. The lancet for bloodletting, the various purging preparations for evacuating excess humors, the plasters and poultices for wound dressing, the pain preparations derived from opium and other plant materials, the cauterizing iron for the sealing of wounds, and the management of gangrene. The chest also contained, in better provisioned ships, the surgical tools for amputation, the saw, the knife, the instruments for managing the stump, because amputation was the primary surgical intervention available for the severe injuries of the working sailor. The surgeon's training was practical rather than university-based in most cases. He was a barber surgeon by training, his skills acquired through apprenticeship and practice then through the academic medical education of the university physician. This was not entirely a disadvantage. The practical surgeon had hands-on experience that the theoretical physician lacked, and the specific skills of wound management, fracture setting, and the surgical procedures he was trained in were more directly relevant to the maritime medical environment than the theoretical framework of the humors that organized academic medicine. But the humoral framework was still the organizing principle of his understanding of disease, and the treatments he applied for the non-surgical conditions, the fevers, the gastrointestinal illness, the scurvy, were the humoral treatments, bleeding, purging, the administration of the preparations in his chest that the theory directed him toward, your infected hand. The surgeon examines it with the specific clinical attention of his training, the redness, the warmth, the swelling. In the humoral framework, these are signs of excess, heat, and blood, an inflammatory process requiring cooling and reduction. The treatment, a poultice of cooling herbs, applied to the wound, possibly bloodletting from the arm above the infection to reduce the blood excess, driving the inflammation, and the application of a preparation from the medicine chest designed to draw out the corrupt matter. What is actually happening in your hand is a bacterial infection, most likely Staphylococcus or Streptococcus, common environmental bacteria that have entered the wound through the rope burn and are reproducing in the tissue. The infection is spreading along the lymphatic channels. The red line moving up your arm toward the wrist is lymphangitis, the infection tracking along the lymphatic drainage pathway, which, in the pre-antibiotic era, was a sign of serious and potentially fatal progression. The treatment your surgeon is applying will not address the bacterial infection because he doesn't know there is a bacterial infection. The germ theory is 4 centuries away. The poultice may or may not have antibacterial properties depending on its specific ingredients. The bloodletting will weaken you and won't help the infection. The drawing preparation may keep the wound open and draining, which might incidentally reduce the bacterial load in the wound cavity, or might introduce more contamination depending on what it contains. Whether you survive this infection is going to be determined primarily by your immune system and by whether the infection progresses to septicemia, the systemic bloodstream infection. Before your immune system controls the local wound infection, the surgeon's interventions will be largely irrelevant to this outcome, but the surgeon is doing what his training and his theory tell him to do, and his attentiveness to you is genuine, even if his tools are inadequate. Tropical disease was the medical challenge that the age of exploration most profoundly failed to address, because it was the challenge that European medicine had no experience of and no theoretical framework for processing. The sailors and soldiers of the early Portuguese and Spanish voyages encountered malaria, yellow fever, dysentery, typhus, and a range of other infectious diseases in the tropical regions they explored, and they died of them in numbers that the chronicles consistently underreport because the deaths of common sailors were not considered worth the detailed documentation that the deaths of officers occasionally received. Malaria, transmitted by the Anopheles mosquito in tropical and subtropical regions, was perhaps the most significant single infectious disease threat of the age of exploration's tropical operations. The Portuguese sailors establishing trading posts on the West African coast, the Spanish colonists in the Caribbean, the expeditions into the tropical mainland of the Americas, all encountered malaria in regions where it was endemic and died of it without understanding the mechanism of transmission or having any effective treatment. The malaria of tropical West Africa was particularly lethal for Europeans who had no prior exposure and no acquired immunity. The mortality rates of European expeditions operating in tropical Africa during the age of exploration were catastrophic. The fever that the sailors called the sickness of the country, or various regional names, could kill a significant fraction of an expedition's personnel within weeks of exposure. The mortality was high enough that some of the most important European trading posts on the West African coast were operated with the understanding that the European personnel stationed there had a limited life expectancy and were supplied with regular replacement personnel to manage the attrition. The specific medical response to malaria in the period was the humoral response. The fever was excess heat, to be managed with cooling preparations, bleeding to reduce the blood excess, and the various preparations of the medicine chest. None of this treated malaria. The only treatment that would have worked, quinine, derived from the bark of the cinchona tree of South America, was not known to European medicine until the 17th century, after it was identified by indigenous South American peoples, whose knowledge of local plant medicine included the anti-malarial properties of cinchona bark. The irony that the cure for the disease that was killing the European sailors of the age of exploration was available in the Americas they were exploring, was known to the people they were encountering, in some cases enslaving, in some cases killing, is one of those historical ironies that resist comfortable resolution. The knowledge was there, in the medicinal traditions of the indigenous peoples. The exchange of that knowledge, the process by which cinchona bark became known to European medicine, happened gradually and incompletely through the 16th and 17th centuries in the context of the colonial relationships that were themselves producing the exposure to malaria. Dysentery, the intestinal infection producing severe bloody diarrhea caused by bacterial or amoebic pathogens transmitted through contaminated food and water, was endemic on long voyages. The contaminated water casks, the inadequate food hygiene of the ship's cooking, the close quarters of the crew, all created the conditions for dysentery's transmission, and the dehydration produced by severe dysentery in men who were already on limited water rations was potentially lethal in its own right. The treatment of dysentery with the available medicines was at best palliative. The opium preparations that reduced the intestinal motility and provided some relief from the cramping, the astringent preparations that reduced the inflammation. The fundamental problem, the contaminated water or food that was the source of infection, was not addressable on a ship at sea and the sick man who had recovered from one episode of dysentery was likely to be reinfected from the same source. Amputation. We should address amputation specifically because it was the major surgical procedure of the period, and because the conditions under which it was performed on a ship at sea were not the conditions under which its outcomes were best. A sailor whose hand or arm or leg had been crushed by equipment, or whose wound had progressed to gangrene beyond the possibility of local management, faced the prospect of amputation performed on a ship at sea without anesthesia, with the instruments and the training of the ship's surgeon in the conditions of the ship's environment. The dampness, the motion, the limited ability to maintain sterility, even by the standards of an era before sterility was understood. The amputation itself was performed as quickly as possible. Speed was the primary technique for managing the pain of surgery without anesthesia, and the best ship's surgeons were fast. The patient was held or restrained, given wine in large quantities if available, and the procedure was completed in the minimum time that the technical requirements permitted. The pain was extreme. The restraint was necessary. The wine helped within its limitations. The post-operative management was where the ship's environment created its specific problems. The wound needed to be kept as clean as possible in an environment where cleanliness was not available. The patient needed rest and nutrition in an environment where rest was limited by the watch system and nutrition was limited by the ship's provisions. The surgical site needed to be protected from the salt spray and the mechanical damage of a working ship environment. Surgical survival rates at sea were lower than surgical survival rates in land-based hospitals, even of the period, not because the ship's surgeons were less skilled than their land-based counterparts, but because the post-operative environment was worse, and the complication rates of wound infection, which was the primary post-operative killer, were higher in the ship's conditions than in the hospitals. The men who survived surgery at sea were men who had robust immune systems, good baseline nutritional status, and sufficient luck to avoid the post-operative infection that the environment made probable. Some survived. The accounts document their recovery with the matter-of-fact economy of people describing an unlikely but not impossible outcome. The men who didn't survive surgery at sea were buried at sea. The ceremony was brief: the prayer, the sewing of the body in canvas with a weight at the feet, the slide into the water, the watching of the white canvas disappearing into the blue. And then the ship continued, because the ship always continued. Chapter 8. The Violence. What happened when your ship met other ships, and why it wasn't always clear who was the enemy. The age of exploration was also the age of maritime violence, and the two are not separable. The ships that opened the ocean routes were ships that were armed, that operated in a context of political and commercial competition that regularly expressed itself through force, and that encountered indigenous populations of the regions they were exploring in relationships that ranged from peaceful trade to armed conflict, with the full spectrum of ambiguity between. The sailor of the age of exploration was not only a mariner managing the physical challenges of the ocean, he was a combatant in a maritime world where violence was a structural feature of the commercial and political environment. The armament of the exploration-era ship reflected this reality. The Portuguese carracks and Spanish naus were not warships in the dedicated sense. They were armed merchant vessels, carrying cannon and other weapons as protection for the commercial mission, rather than as primary weapons of military function. But armed merchant vessel and warship was a distinction without a sharp boundary in the 15th and 16th centuries, when the same vessel might trade peacefully in one port and engage in combat in the next, when the line between privateering and piracy was legally defined but practically permeable, and when the maritime powers of Europe were engaged in a competition for commercial dominance that they expressed through force whenever force was advantageous. The canon of the age of exploration ship was a significant technological development in naval warfare. The transition from the galley combat of the Mediterranean, which was primarily a matter of rowing ships together and fighting hand-to-hand, to the broadside engagement of the sailing warship, which allowed vessels to fire heavy weapons at range. The Portuguese in particular developed the naval gunnery that made their ships effective fighting platforms in the Indian Ocean, where they encountered established maritime trading networks defended by the Mamluk fleet, the Arab merchants, and eventually the Ottoman Navy. Naval combat in the age of exploration was conducted at ranges that, by the standards of modern warfare, were extremely close. The effective range of the cannon of the period was a few hundred meters at most, and the engagement ranges at which accurate fire could be achieved were much shorter. The tactic of closing to near point-blank range before firing was standard, and the exchange of fire at close range with iron cannonballs was a specifically brutal form of combat that the period's accounts describe in terms that give you an accurate picture of what it involved. A cannonball that hit a ship's hull at close range did not merely make a hole. It shattered the hull planking, sending wooden splinters in all directions at high velocity. The splinters, not the cannonball itself, were the primary cause of casualties in naval combat of the period. A cannonball hitting the gun deck of a 16th century warship produced a spray of wooden splinters that could kill and maim everyone in its path, and the accounts of naval combat consistently describe the casualties from splinters as exceeding the casualties from direct hits. The man standing near a gun when the planking next to him was struck by a cannonball might survive the ball itself and be killed by the fragments of his own ship. The fighting at close range, when the ships were alongside each other, the boarding action, was the other primary form of naval combat, and it brought the sailor into direct individual combat with the men on the opposing vessel. The boarding party went over the side with whatever hand weapons they carried: swords, axes, pikes, firearms of the period, the arquebus, and later the musket, and fought on the deck of the boarded vessel in the confusion and violence of close-quarters combat. The sailor's combat preparation was not the systematic military training of the professional soldier. He was a mariner who was also required to fight when the situation demanded, and his weapons handling was the product of whatever training his ship's captain had provided and whatever personal experience he had accumulated. The professional soldier, the men-at-arms, who were sometimes carried on significant voyages as a dedicated fighting force, was a different animal from the ordinary sailor pressed into combat, and the outcomes of boarding actions often reflected this distinction. The opponents you might encounter on the ocean routes were various. Other European ships, not necessarily enemies, since the difference between peaceful interaction and hostile interaction between ships of different nations was determined by the political situation and the specific assessment of relative strength. Ships of the Islamic maritime world, the Ottoman and Mamluk fleets in the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea, the Arab and Indian merchants of the Indian Ocean trade routes, with whom the Portuguese were in active commercial and military competition from the early 16th century. Ships of the indigenous maritime cultures of Southeast Asia and the Pacific, whose encounters with European vessels ranged from trade to ambush, depending on the specific history of the location. The specifically confused situation was the encounter with a ship of uncertain nationality and intention. In the 16th century, the visual signals that identified a ship's nationality, the flags it flew, the design of its hull, were interpretable at short range and open to deception. A ship flying one nation's colors might be a pirate flying false colors, or a privateer authorized by a rival nation to take prizes, or a legitimate merchant of the nation whose colors it flew, and the determination of which sometimes required the kind of interrogation that was itself a potential trigger for hostilities. The decision to engage or not engage was the captain's, and it was a decision made on imperfect information with potentially lethal consequences in either direction. Engage a neutral vessel, and you were a pirate. Fail to engage a pirate, and you lost your cargo and possibly your ship. The maritime law of the period provided a framework for these decisions: the letters of marque and reprisal, the privateer's commission, the rules of prize. But the enforcement of that framework was inconsistent, and the practical reality of being at sea with an armed vessel and an ambiguous encounter was messier than the legal framework implied. The encounter with hostile indigenous peoples on unknown coasts was a specific category of danger that the early exploration voyages managed with varying degrees of skill, cultural understanding, and basic human decency. the accounts of first contact between European exploration vessels and indigenous peoples of the Americas, Africa, and Asia range from the peaceful and commercially productive to the violent and mutually disastrous, and the factors that determined which outcome occurred are a complex mixture of specific circumstances, individual personalities, prior contact history, and the fundamental asymmetry of a situation in which one party had guns and the other, in most cases, did not. For the common sailor on a ship that had been at sea for months, arriving at a coast that the charts described as unknown or only partially known, the indigenous people encountered on that coast were a category that his experience and his cultural framework had not prepared him for. The specific combination of exhaustion, malnutrition, cultural incomprehension, and the institutional violence of the maritime and colonial project produced encounters that the sailor experienced as threats, the arrows of a defending population looking exactly like hostile aggression from the perspective of the man they were aimed at, regardless of the sequence of provocations that had led to the arrow being loosed. Magellan died on the beach at Mactan in the Philippines in April 1521, killed in a battle with the forces of Lapu-Lapu, a chieftain who declined to accept the authority of the Spanish king that Magellan had declared over his island. Magellan had made the tactical mistake of leading the assault himself, wading through the shallows with a small force against a significantly larger defending force, and the specifics of the battle, the arrows and the spears, and the man who was technically the commander of the first expedition to circumnavigate the globe dying on a Philippine beach, illustrate the specific, violent contingent reality of the age of exploration in a way that the abstract historical narrative doesn't quite capture. The sailors who survived the battle at Mactan, who buried Magellan and continued the voyage under new command, were men who had now seen their commander killed in combat, who were 3/4 of the way through a circumnavigation that had already killed most of their original companions, and who had to sail the remaining ships home with crews too reduced to man them properly. They did it. Elcano brought the Victoria into the harbor of Seville in September 1522 with 18 men, 18 survivors, out of the approximately 270 who had set out 3 years earlier. 18 men, the arithmetic of what it cost to be the first crew to circumnavigate the globe, is not the arithmetic of glory. It is the arithmetic of scurvy, and storms and starvation and combat and disease, and the various individual disasters of 3 years at sea. The 18 who returned were the ones who survived all of it, through skill and endurance, and the specific good fortune of being among the 18 rather than the 250. Chapter 9. The Pay. What you were promised, what you received, and why the difference mattered. Let's talk about money, because money was why you were here. The romantic motivations, the adventure, the exploration, the service of the crown, were real for some men and not others. The financial motivation was real for virtually everyone who signed articles for an age of exploration voyage, because the voyage was work, and work existed in the context of the economic realities of the 15th and 16th century maritime world, and the economic realities were specific enough that understanding them is essential to understanding why men undertook voyages that killed them at the rate that the historical record documents. The advance pay was the first financial fact of your situation. Before the voyage departed, the crew was paid a portion of their contracted wages in advance, the adelanto in the Spanish system, which served multiple purposes. It demonstrated the seriousness of the venture and the financial backing behind it. It provided immediate cash to men who had debts or dependents, and it created a specific financial obligation. The man who took the advance and then deserted before sailing had stolen money, which was a crime with legal consequences. The advance pay was, partly, a mechanism for ensuring that the crew actually got on the ship on sailing day. The total wage for a voyage was calculated as a rate per month, and the month in question was an unknown number. You were contracted at a monthly rate for a voyage whose duration you didn't know, to destinations whose distance and difficulty the captain might not be fully disclosing, under conditions that the articles described in terms general enough to leave considerable flexibility for the officer's interpretation of what the crew had agreed to. The monthly wage for an ordinary sailor on a Portuguese or Spanish exploration voyage of the late 15th century was modest, sufficient for a man without other resources to consider it worthwhile, insufficient to represent the kind of windfall that would make the risks clearly rational. The pilot and the officers were paid considerably more, which reflected their skill and responsibility, and which was understood by the crew with the resigned awareness of a hierarchy that was not going to be restructured by complaint. The additional income that made the ordinary sailor's participation potentially worthwhile was the share of trade goods, prizes, or bonuses that the captain and the backers of the voyage were authorized to distribute to the crew. This share was specified in the articles, a defined fraction of the commercial proceeds of the voyage, distributed according to rank. And it was this share that made a commercially successful voyage genuinely remunerative for the ordinary crew. On a successful voyage, one that reached its destination, conducted its trade, and returned with valuable cargo, the crew's share could be significantly more than their base wages. The Portuguese voyages to India, which returned with pepper, spices, and luxury goods, whose value in the European market was enormous, created the possibility of wealth for the ordinary sailor that their base wage did not suggest. The first return voyage from India could transform a sailor's financial situation in ways that explained why men volunteered for the next India voyage, despite knowing what the conditions were like. The problem was that successful voyages were not the only voyages. Unsuccessful voyages, voyages that were lost at sea, that failed to reach their destinations, that returned without cargo, that were captured or destroyed by hostile forces, were also part of the picture, and the financial calculus of the ordinary sailor had to account for the possibility that the voyage would not return. A sailor who died on the voyage did not collect his wages. The wages of dead sailors were managed through the voyage's accounting system, in theory payable to heirs or dependents, in practice subject to the various administrative processes and potential corruption of the voyage's financial management. The widow or the family of a sailor lost on a voyage had an uncertain claim on what he was owed, processed through systems that were not organized for their convenience. The prize money of successful combat, the share of the value of captured enemy ships and cargo, was an additional source of income for sailors on voyages that included naval action, and the distribution of prize money was one of the more contentious aspects of maritime financial management. The formal rules specified the distribution: so many shares for the captain, so many for the officers, so many for the common crew. But the actual execution of these distributions was subject to the captain's honest accounting of the prize's value, which was not always fully transparent. The dispute over prize distribution was a source of significant tension in the aftermath of voyages that had included combat and capture, and the legal records of the period include numerous cases of sailors or their heirs disputing the share they had received from prize money against what the articles had promised. These disputes were processed through maritime courts with mixed results for the ordinary sailor, who was at a disadvantage in navigating legal proceedings against the merchant backers and officers who had the resources for sustained litigation. The debt that many sailors had accumulated by the time they returned, the advances against wages that had been borrowed against the voyage's proceeds, the debts to suppliers and taverns in port, the various financial obligations that had been deferred pending the voyage's return, meant that the wages collected on return were often already spoken for before the sailor had them in his hands. The man who arrived in Lisbon or Seville after 18 months at sea with his wages and his share of the voyage's proceeds had creditors waiting on the dock, as well as family, and the financial benefit of the voyage was sometimes reduced by the time the debts were settled to less than the rational calculation of the risks would have justified. The returning sailor, who had survived everything the voyage offered, the scurvy and the storms, and the bad water and the violence, and the medicine chest, and all the rest of it, was not guaranteed a triumphant financial outcome. He was guaranteed the experience of having survived, which was not nothing, and the experience of having seen what the world looked like beyond the horizon of familiar Europe, which was not nothing either. He was also, in many cases, looking at the dock and thinking about whether he could be persuaded to do it again, and the fact that many of them were. The fact that the same men appear in the records of multiple voyages, signing articles again and again for ships headed into the same conditions they had barely survived the last time, tells you something about the pull of the sea that the misery account alone doesn't capture. Chapter 10. What kept them going? Reasons. Men sailed anyway, and what that tells us. This script has been, in significant part, a catalog of miseries. The food that degraded and killed, the water that went green and ran out, the scurvy that dissolved the body from inside, the storms that swept men from the yards, the medicine that made things worse, the hierarchy that could flog you for complaining about any of it, the pay that was less than promised, and arrived after the deductions you hadn't fully accounted for. All of this is true. All of it is documented in the accounts and the records and the clinical descriptions and the legal proceedings that the age of exploration left behind. And yet the ship sailed, voyage after voyage, decade after decade. The docks of Lisbon and Seville and Bristol and Amsterdam sent out ships crewed by men who knew, from the accounts of previous voyages, from the talk of the taverns, from the physical evidence of the men who came back from previous voyages, what they were signing up for. Some of them had no choice, in the sense that their options were so constrained by poverty, debt, or legal trouble, that a voyage was the best of their available alternatives. This is real and important, and should not be minimized. The economic conditions of the 15th and 16th century Europe produced a significant population of men for whom maritime labor, with all its risks, was a rational economic choice compared to the alternatives on land. But economic compulsion doesn't fully explain the repeated voyager. The man who signed articles for a second voyage, a third, who built a career at sea across multiple long-distance expeditions. For these men, the sea was something chosen and rechosen, and understanding why requires taking seriously what the sea offered as well as what it threatened. The pay on a successful voyage was real. We've established that the ordinary sailor on a commercially productive voyage could earn significantly more than his land-based counterpart. And this financial argument was genuine and repeatedly confirmed by the evidence of the return voyages from the spice routes. The risk was high, but the potential reward was high, and men with the specific risk tolerance of the young and the poor made the calculation and signed. The adventure was real. This is the dimension of the sailor's motivation that the professional historian is sometimes reluctant to take at face value, because adventure sounds like the romantic mythology overlaid on the harder economic and social reality. But the accounts of sailors who described their voyages in terms that were not exclusively miserable, who wrote about the wonders they had seen, the coasts they had been the first Europeans to sight, the stars of the southern hemisphere that no one from their village had ever seen. We're telling a truth that the misery narrative doesn't contradict. Both things were true simultaneously. The voyage was brutal, and the voyage was extraordinary, and the men who sailed them carried both realities. The specific psychological draw of the sea, the specific documented pull that the ocean exerted on men who had been at sea and returned, is one of those phenomena that the accounts describe but don't fully explain. The sailors who came back from long voyages and found themselves unable to settle to the routines of land, who were restless and disconnected until they were back on a ship, who described the land as confining in ways they couldn't quite articulate. These men were experiencing something real about the sea and the sailor's relationship with it that the misery account alone doesn't capture. The sea was a world with its own rules, its own rhythms, its own specific demands that organized life in ways that the complexity and ambiguity of land-based society did not. The watch system, however exhausting, was a clear structure. The hierarchy, however brutal, was a clear hierarchy. The tasks of the working ship, however physically demanding, were tasks with immediate, visible purposes. The sail needs to be set. The line needs to be spliced. The helm needs to hold this heading. The clarity of the ship's demands was, for some men, a relief from the murkier demands of a land life in which purpose was less immediately visible. The comradeship of the crew was also real, the specific social bond of men who have been through extreme conditions together, who have been in the same storm, eaten the same bad food, drunk the same green water, watched the same man fall from the yard into the sea and be left behind, was a bond that the returning sailor found difficult to replicate on land. The men you sailed with knew what you had been through in a way that the people who stayed on shore did not and could not, and this shared knowledge created a closeness that the sailor's later life sometimes measured all other relationships against. The religious dimension was also real, in ways that the secular modern imagination doesn't always fully credit. The sailors of the age of exploration were men of faith, not in the vague cultural sense, but in the specific, practiced sense of people for whom the church's rituals and prayers and the intercession of saints were genuine and important daily realities. The prayers said before departure, the masses at sea when conditions allowed, the specific devotion to Our Lady of the Sea, and the various maritime saints, these were not merely custom. They were the framework through which the sailor understood his voyage as purposeful beyond its commercial mission, as part of a larger divine order in which his specific suffering had meaning. The idea that the exploration of the unknown world was a Christian mission, the extension of the faith to peoples who had not received it, the fulfillment of a providential design that made the Portuguese and Spanish voyages part of a sacred history, was not propaganda for the sailors, at least not entirely. It was a framework that gave the hardship meaning, that made the deaths of companions something other than random biological events, that placed the suffering of the voyage in a context of significance that the suffering itself would not otherwise have had. The men who had visions of the Virgin Mary in storms, who attributed their survival of the Cape of Good Hope to divine intercession, who gave thanks at shrines on their return for the specific mercy that had brought them home. These men were not being irrational by their own lights. They were interpreting their experiences through the framework that their culture provided for interpreting extreme experiences, and the framework provided what extreme experiences require, meaning. The world that these sailors opened was transformed by their voyages in ways that the voyagers themselves could not have predicted. The Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, and peoples between the old world and the new that Columbus's voyage initiated, reshaped the global ecology and the global human population in ways whose effects are still working themselves out. The spice trade routes established by the Portuguese created the commercial networks that funded the subsequent centuries of European expansion. The maps that the voyages produced, accumulated, refined, corrected, reprinted, with each new voyage's corrections, were the maps that the subsequent world was navigated by. The sailor who signed articles in Lisbon in 1497 and survived the voyage to India and back was not consciously participating in a world historical transformation. He was a man trying to earn a living in a dangerous trade, managing the specific daily challenges we have been cataloging throughout this script. But the aggregate of all those individual voyages, all those individual decisions to sign and sail, was the thing that the history books call the Age of Exploration, and the history of the world between 1400 and 1600 cannot be written without them. They paid for it with their bodies, with the specific physical suffering that this script has described in detail. The scurvy, the storms, the bad water, the brutal medicine, the violence, the hierarchy, the pay that was less than promised. All of it was real, and all of it was paid by the men whose names mostly don't appear in the history books, alongside the names of the captains and the kings who financed the voyages. Their names are in the muster rolls, if the muster rolls survived. In the crew lists of the ships, if the crew lists were kept, and kept accurately. In the occasional court records, where a dispute over wages or a criminal charge produced a documented individual. In the accounts of men who sailed alongside them and wrote about what they had seen. Most of them are unnamed, most of them are uncounted. The exact number of sailors who died in the Age of Exploration from scurvy and disease and Storms and violence is not known because the counting was never comprehensive enough to produce an accurate number, and the counting that was done prioritized the cargo and the ships over the people. They were real. The misery was real. The courage was real. The specific daily physical endurance of keeping a wooden ship moving across an unknown ocean for months on end, on food that was killing you slowly and water that was making you sick, under officers who could flog you for complaining, toward a destination that might not be where the chart said it was. This was a real human achievement, of the kind that doesn't have a monument in any harbor, but that made the harbors possible. Chapter 11. The Navigation. Not knowing where you are and what happened when the pilot was wrong. You are lost, not lost in the way of someone who has taken a wrong turn on a familiar road and needs to retrace their steps. Lost in the specific, oceanic, potentially fatal way of a ship that is 3 weeks out of the last known landfall, sailing a heading that the pilot calculated from a combination of compass bearing, elapsed time, estimated speed, and the specific accumulated guesswork that the age of exploration called dead reckoning, and that the pilot is now less certain about than he was when he started. Dead reckoning was the primary navigation method of the open ocean crossing, and understanding it requires understanding both what it could do and what it couldn't. The principle was straightforward. If you know where you started, how fast you've been going, and what direction you've been heading, you can calculate where you are now. Start at Lisbon. Sail southwest at approximately 5 knots for 20 days. You should be approximately here. The problem was in every variable of that calculation. The speed was estimated. The chip log, a piece of wood thrown overboard with a rope knotted at intervals, measured the speed at which the rope ran out as the ship moved forward, giving a reading in knots that was accurate for the moment of measurement and inaccurate as an average because the ship's speed varied continuously with the wind. The heading was the compass bearing, which was true in the sense that it reflected the magnetic compass reading, and inaccurate in the sense that the magnetic compass pointed to magnetic north rather than true north. And the difference between magnetic north and true north, the magnetic declination, varied by location in ways that the navigators of the period were aware of but couldn't always accurately account for. The current was the hidden variable that dead reckoning couldn't fully capture. The ocean's surface currents, the Gulf Stream in the North Atlantic, the equatorial current running westward across the South Atlantic, the Benguela current along the African coast, moved the water, and with it the ship, in directions and at speeds that the navigator had no direct way of measuring. A ship sailing due west might be carried north by 3 miles. For every 20 it sailed, the current's contribution invisible to the dead reckoning calculation that assumed the ship's position was determined only by its own movement. The cumulative error of these uncertainties built across the days and weeks of a long crossing. An error of 5 miles per day in the position estimate was modest by the standards of the method. Over 30 days, it produced an error of 150 miles in the estimated position. Over 60 days, the duration of a long Atlantic crossing, the error could be 300 miles or more. A ship that believed it was 300 miles east of its actual position was a ship whose first sight of land would not be where the pilot expected it, and the consequences of that mismatch depended entirely on what was between the ship and the land. It didn't know was closer than it thought. Rocks, shoals, the specific catastrophic encounter between a hull moving at 5 knots and a submerged obstacle that the charts didn't show because no European ship had been there before to survey and record it. The end of the age of exploration is threaded with ships that ran aground on coasts they didn't know were there, on reefs that the charts were blank about, on the specific geological treachery of coastlines that presented a smooth face at a distance and a lethal one up close. The latitude was the one navigational measurement that the period's instruments could provide with reasonable accuracy, and the pilots of the age of exploration used it accordingly. The noon sight, the measurement of the sun's maximum altitude above the horizon at local noon using the astrolabe or the cross staff. gave the latitude directly, the angle related to the sun's declination through a calculation the pilot performed with a set of tables. The latitude was reliable enough that the Portuguese developed the practice of latitude sailing. Sail north or south until you reach the latitude of your destination. Then sail east or west along that latitude until you find the coast. Latitude sailing was reliable within its limitations. It told you how far north or south you were, accurately enough to use. It didn't tell you how far east or west you were, which was the longitude problem. And the longitude problem was the navigation problem that the age of exploration never solved. Longitude, the east-west position, required knowing the difference between local time and a reference time. Local noon occurs when the sun is at its highest point, which happens at different moments at different longitudes. The Earth rotates 15 degrees per hour, so every 4 minutes of time difference corresponds to 1 degree of longitude difference. If you know exactly what time it is at a fixed reference point, at Lisbon say, and you know what time it is locally, you know how far east or west you are from Lisbon. The problem was the clock. A clock accurate enough to maintain precise time over weeks and months at sea through temperature changes and humidity and the motion of the ship did not exist in the age of exploration. The mechanical clocks of the period lost or gained time at rates that made them useless for the precision longitude calculation required. The sand glass, the half-hour sand glass, used for timekeeping on ships, was turned every half hour by the ship's boy assigned to watch it, and the accumulated errors of 100 half-hour turnings over a week at sea made the time kept by sand glass unreliable for the precision required. The longitude problem was not solved until John Harrison's marine chronometer in the 18th century, a clock accurate enough to maintain precise time at sea, whose development was driven by the British government's Longitude Prize of 1714, established precisely because the deaths and shipwrecks caused by longitude errors had become expensive enough to motivate institutional investment in solving it. In your time, the 15th and 16th centuries, the pilot navigating the open ocean knew, with reasonable accuracy, how far north or south he was. He did not know, with the same accuracy, how far east or west he was. He was working with one of the two coordinates of his position and estimating the other, and the estimate accumulated error the further he was from the last definite fix, the specific anxiety of the pilot in the final days of a long crossing. The days when the estimated position said land should be near, but the horizon remained empty, was a recognizable feature of the literature. The pilot who had committed to a position and a heading, who had presented the captain with a confident assessment of where the ship was now approaching the moment of empirical test. Land would either appear where he said it would, or it wouldn't. If it did, his authority and competence were confirmed. If it didn't, if the horizon remained empty, past the day he'd predicted landfall. Or, if land appeared on the wrong bearing, or if the coast they sighted didn't match any chart they had, his authority and competence were in question in a context where authority mattered a great deal. The famous example of Columbus's navigation illustrates the specific creative management of this anxiety. Columbus maintained 2 logs on the 1492 crossing. The real log recording his actual estimated distance traveled, and a false log showing a shorter distance, which he shared with the crew to prevent them from knowing how far from Spain they actually were. The deception was successful in managing the crew's anxiety until it wasn't, until the actual distance exceeded what even the false log showed, and the crew's anxiety became the confrontation of October 10th that nearly ended the voyage. Columbus was also wrong about his position in the specific way that dead reckoning made possible. He believed he had reached the islands of Asia, a belief he maintained with a determination that his navigational methods couldn't refute, because those methods couldn't tell him precisely where he was, only approximately. The gap between approximately in the right place for Japan to be and actually in an entirely different part of the world was not resolvable by the instruments of 1492. The pilot who was wrong about his position had options ranging from professionally embarrassing to catastrophically fatal. Wrong in the open ocean, with sea room to correct. You revise the estimate, you adjust the heading. You sail on with the humility of someone whose calculation has been shown to be imprecise, and the professional competence to produce a better calculation from the available information. Wrong on a lee shore in the dark, with the sound of surf already audible. You are in the specific situation that the phrase shipwreck describes, and the time available for the transition from navigational error to catastrophe is measured in minutes. The navigational disasters of the age of exploration were numerous and various. Francisco de Almeida's fleet, returning from India in 1510, misjudged the Cape of Good Hope's position in heavy weather and lost several ships on rocks. The fleet of João de Lisboa, the Portuguese squadron sent to explore the South American coast in 1513, lost a ship on a coast the charts showed as clear. The countless unnamed, unrecorded wrecks of ships that sailed out and didn't come back, whose navigational error was never available for the historical record because there were no survivors to report it. The wrecked ship was the navigator's nightmare and the sailor's specific dread, not the dramatic death of combat or the slow deterioration of scurvy, but the sudden violent encounter between the ship and the sea floor, the chaos of a vessel breaking up on rocks, the specific desperate calculation of who could swim and who couldn't, and whether the shore was close enough to reach. Most sailors of the age of exploration could not swim. This sounds counterintuitive. Surely the people who spent their lives at sea would be the people who learned to swim. But the maritime culture of the period held an ambivalent and sometimes actively negative attitude towards swimming, on the grounds that a sailor who could swim would merely prolong his death in a shipwreck rather than dying quickly, and that the ability to swim encouraged the taking of risks in the water that non-swimmers avoided. The logic is internally consistent if you accept its premise, and the premise was accepted widely enough that swimming was not a standard skill of the age of exploration sailor. The sailor who couldn't swim and whose ship was wrecking on a rocky coast had the specific options available to him. Stay with the ship until it broke up, and hope that a fragment of timber would serve as a float, or get into the ship's boat if the boat could be launched in the conditions, or find some way to make the shore before the water did what water does to a person who cannot keep themselves at the surface. Some made it. The accounts of shipwreck survivors describe reaching shore on pieces of wreckage, on improvised floats, on the specific force of will of people who refused the sea's invitation to stop struggling. The accounts of the ones who didn't make it are, by definition, not available. The coast when it appeared, the right coast, the navigated coast, the coast that appeared where the pilot said it would, was one of the great relief moments of the age of exploration voyage. The cry of "land" from the masthead was the sound of the navigation having worked, the dead reckoning having been close enough, the accumulated errors of weeks at sea not having been fatal. The crew who heard it and looked to the horizon and saw the smudge of land against the sky were experiencing something that the word relief doesn't quite capture. A specific profound release of the sustained tension of the crossing that expressed itself in ways the accounts describe with a directness that theory can't improve on. Men wept, men prayed, men who had been at odds with each other for weeks embraced. The hierarchy that had maintained itself through flogging and rationing, and the continuous assertion of authority was briefly humanized by the shared release of a tension that the hierarchy had shared equally with the crew it commanded. And then the pilot looked at the coast and tried to figure out exactly where they were, because dead reckoning had gotten them to approximately the right place. But approximately still left questions, and the coast needed to be identified before the approach could be safely made, and the charts of the period's unknown coasts were often too imprecise to make the identification quick or confident. The navigation problem didn't end with the sighting of land. It continued in a different form all the way to the anchor. Conclusion: the dock again. Lisbon, 1499. Or Seville, 1522. Or Plymouth, 1580. The specific date matters less than the scene. The ship coming in, the crew on deck, the dock crowded with the people who came to watch the return of a voyage that many had not expected to see return. The men on deck are not the men who left. Not literally. Some of them are not the men who left, because the men who left are in the ocean somewhere, or in a foreign harbor, or in a grave on a coast whose name the charts now have and didn't have before. But even the men who left and returned are not those men. The months at sea have done things to their bodies and their faces that the dock doesn't immediately recognize. The weight they've lost, the specific look of men who have been through something that the people on the dock have not, and that cannot be fully explained in any conversation. The returning sailor walks down the gangplank onto solid ground and discovers that the ground is moving. Not actually moving, but the vestibular system that has adapted to 3 months of the ship's motion. Experiences the unmoving dock as the wrong sensation, and the sailor who has just crossed an ocean walks with the slightly uncertain gait of a man whose inner ear is recalibrating. This is called land sickness, and it passes, and it is the last gift of the sea before the sea lets him go. He has survived, not unscathed. The scurvy has done something to his teeth that won't fully reverse. The tropical fever has done something to his liver that he doesn't know about. The rope burn that infected and then was treated with a hot iron has left a scar on his hand that will be there for the rest of his life. But he is alive and on the dock, and the voyage is over. And the specific crystalline fact of being alive and on solid ground after what he has been through is one of those experiences that only the people who have earned it can fully understand. He will be back. Not necessarily immediately. The body needs time to recover. The soul needs time to process. The financial disputes need time to be resolved. But the sea is the sea, and the dock is the dock, and the ships are always being fitted out for the next voyage. And the men who have sailed before are the men the next captain wants on his crew because they know what the voyage is. They know it, and they come back anyway, which is the specific, complicated thing about sailors that the simple misery account doesn't capture, and the simple heroism account doesn't capture either. The truth is both things held together. The voyage was as bad as this script has described. The food was that bad. The water was that bad. The scurvy was that bad. The storms were that bad. The medicine was that useless. The hierarchy was that brutal. All of it was that bad. And the world is the shape it is partly because men did it anyway, partly because men signed articles in taverns and sailed over the edge of the known world into the unknown. And some of them came back and some of them didn't, and the ones who came back sometimes went again. The age of exploration was not built by the captains whose names are on the maps. It was built by the sailors whose names are in the muster rolls, in the small handwriting of the clerk who recorded who shipped out and sometimes who came back. They built it with their bodies, with their scurvy and their hunger and their thirst and their fear and their endurance and their dark humor and their specific stubborn, irrational willingness to get back on the ship. The ship is in front of you. The tide turns in an hour.